She had 48 hours to find a husband, or lose the only thing her father ever left her. Not a ring, not a savings account, not even a goodbye that made sense. Just a diner, flickering neon, grease-stained walls that smelled like him, and a legal clause buried in a dead man's will that said, "Married by Friday," or it all goes to someone who will tear it down brick by brick. So at 11:53 on a Tuesday night, Mara Ellison did the only desperate thing left. She slid a handwritten note across the counter to a stranger. Like this video. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Follow me and stay until the end. You will not see this one coming. Okay. The diner had no business still being open at this hour. It was 11:40 in the evening on a Tuesday, which meant the last real customer had left 40 minutes ago, which meant the only person left in the place besides Mara was the man in the corner booth, the one who always came in around 9, ordered the same thing without looking at the menu, and read until she turned the lights down low enough to be a hint. He never took the hint. He just switched on the small brass reading lamp he'd started bringing himself 3 weeks ago. Like he'd decided this corner booth was his, and the rest of the world could negotiate. Mara had stopped minding. She wasn't sure exactly when that had happened. Somewhere between the 3rd week of his presence and the 4th, she had stopped clocking him as a nuisance and started treating him as furniture. Steady, quiet, and easier to work around than to fight. His name, she knew only from the card he'd left the one time he'd paid with credit instead of cash. L. Riva. The L could have been anything. She hadn't asked. He hadn't offered. That was the arrangement, unspoken and mutual, and it had worked fine until tonight, when everything else stopped working and Mara found herself standing behind the counter at 11:40 with a piece of notepad paper in her hand and nowhere else to turn. She'd written it out 3 times. The first draft had been too long. 2 full paragraphs explaining the will, the clause, the stepmother, the developer, the deadline. She'd read it back and heard how insane it sounded and torn it up. The second draft had been 3 sentences, clinical, almost reasonable. She'd read that one back too, and something about the flatness of it had made her feel like she was already defeated before she'd even asked. The third draft was 1 sentence and a question mark. I need someone to marry me by Friday. Would you consider it? She stood behind the counter holding it and tried to remember the last time she hadn't been afraid of something. She couldn't get there. Fear had become the baseline so gradually she'd stopped recognizing it as a separate thing from breathing. The coffee maker beeped. She ignored it. The man in the corner turned a page. Mara folded the note once, picked up the coffee pot she'd already refilled twice without being asked, and walked across the diner. Her sneakers were quiet on the tile. The fluorescent tube above the counter had been flickering for 6 days. She kept meaning to replace it and kept not having the time or the money to do it. And it threw everything into this stuttering rhythm, light shadow, that made the whole place feel like it was breathing wrong. She stopped at his table. He didn't look up immediately. He finished the line he was reading. She could see his eyes track to the end of it. And then he closed the book, keeping one finger inside to hold his place, and looked at her. His eyes were light-colored. Gray, maybe, or that particular shade of pale blue that reads as gray in bad lighting. They were very still. Not blank. She'd known blank, and this wasn't it. Just contained, like whatever was happening behind them was happening slowly and deliberately. You've refilled this twice, he said. His voice was low and even, not unkind. I know. She set the pot down on the table anyway and put the folded note beside it. That's not why I came over. He looked at the note. He looked back at her. You can read it or not, she said. Either way, I'm not going to make it weird. She had absolutely already made it weird. She could hear herself making it weird. But there was no going back from setting a folded piece of paper on a man's table at 11:40 on a Tuesday, so she stood there and breathed through it. He picked up the note, unfolded it once, read it. His expression didn't change, not in any dramatic way. There was a slight shift around his eyes, something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite amusement. And then he looked up at her again, and the stillness was back. Friday, he said. Friday, she confirmed. By 5 o'clock. There's a... She stopped, pressed her teeth together, forced herself to say it plainly, because if she started softening it now, she'd never stop. There's a clause in my father's will. He died 3 weeks ago. The diner goes to his estate by default if I'm not married by the end of this week, and the estate executor is my stepmother, who has already agreed to sell it to a developer named Victor Kessler, who will demolish it in 30 days. I've talked to 2 lawyers. The clause is airtight. I don't have... Her jaw tightened. She breathed. I don't have anyone else to ask. Silence. The refrigeration unit behind the counter hummed. The flickering tube stuttered overhead. Outside, a car passed on the wet street, headlights cutting briefly across the window and sweeping the far wall before disappearing. He was still looking at her. Not through her, at her, which was somehow worse, because it meant he was actually processing what she'd said instead of already forming his refusal. I'm not asking you to love me, she said. Her voice stayed level. She was proud of that. I'm not asking for anything beyond a legal signature and a few weeks of pretending, if it even has to come to that. After the property is secured, I'll handle the rest. You'd be free to... How much do you know about me? She blinked. What? How much do you know about me? He said it again, not as a question this time. Quiet, factual. Mara looked at him. Really looked. The way she hadn't let herself do before because it felt like prying into something she didn't have the right to. He was maybe mid-30s. Dark hair, not quite neat, but not careless either. Like someone who had a barber and didn't care what happened between appointments. Clothes that were expensive in a way that wasn't loud about it. The book he was reading was something in Italian. The coffee he drank was always black, no sugar, no milk, and he drank it slowly, like he was thinking about each sip. Nothing, she said. Your last name from the credit card. That's it. He nodded once, like that was the correct answer. Then you're asking a stranger. Yes. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he opened his book again. Friday, he said. I can do Friday. Mara didn't sleep that night. She lay on the cot she'd set up in the back office 3 weeks ago because she couldn't make herself go back to the apartment she'd shared with her father for the last 2 years, couldn't face those rooms, the specific silence of them, and she stared at the water stain on the ceiling that was shaped vaguely like a dog with a broken ear, and she thought about what she'd done. She'd asked a stranger to marry her. He'd said yes. Those 2 facts sat in her chest like rocks, and no matter how she turned them over, she couldn't find the angle that made them feel real. She kept expecting panic to set in. Real panic, the hyperventilating kind. The kind that had found her 3 nights after her father's funeral when she'd been standing in the diner kitchen at 2 in the morning eating cold eggs out of a pan because she couldn't remember if she'd eaten that day. That panic had been honest. It had made sense. This felt like something past panic, some quieter and more dangerous territory where nothing made sense and you just kept moving because stopping was the only thing you were actually afraid of. Her father had built this place with $14,000, a second mortgage, and a belief in breakfast food that Mara had always found both ridiculous and completely characteristic of him. Ray Ellison had been a man who committed, not always wisely, not always in ways that worked out, but fully, without reservation, the way that some people are just wired, fully forward into whatever they decided to believe in. And he'd believed in the diner, and he'd believed in Mara, and he'd believed in the idea that honest work and decent food were worth protecting. He had not believed in second wives, as it turned out, but he'd had one anyway. Diane. 5 years of marriage, 3 years of distance, 1 death that caught everyone too fast for anything to be resolved, and a will that his lawyer had apparently drafted during a period of optimism about the marriage that no longer reflected reality. The clause was insane. Even the lawyer who'd explained it to her, a tired man named Gerald Holt who'd seen too many family disputes to be shocked by anything, had said it with a particular look on his face, the look of a person who has learned to deliver absurdity without commentary. In the event that the primary beneficiary, Mara Ellison, is unmarried at the time of the will's execution, full ownership of the property, located at 414 Ferris Street, including all assets therein, shall transfer to the estate, to be administered by the surviving spouse. He thought it would motivate me, Mara had said. Gerald Holt had made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He thought a lot of things, Mara had said, and then she'd stopped talking because the alternative was crying in Gerald Holt's office, and she'd already done that once and didn't intend to repeat it. But the morning arrived the way mornings do when you haven't slept, sudden and gray and slightly accusatory. Mara was behind the counter by 6:15 because the diner opened at 6:30, and Danny, her one remaining employee, was reliable in the way that people who really need their paycheck tend to be reliable, and she didn't want to be setting up when he arrived. She needed the 45 minutes alone. She needed the ritual of it. The coffee started, the prep work, the chalk menu board updated, the napkin dispensers refilled, because ritual was the only thing that felt like solid ground anymore. Danny came in at 6:28, shrugged off his jacket, tied on his apron, and said, "You look terrible." "Thank you, Danny." "You sleep at all?" "Some." This was not true, but it was the kind of not true that both of them understood and neither of them would press. The morning rush, such as it was, lasted from 6:30 to about 8:15. The diner sat 42 people at capacity, and they'd been running at about 60% of that on good days, lower on bad ones, ever since the new place had opened 4 blocks east. A chrome and exposed brick situation that served $16 avocado toast and had a line out the door by 7:30. Mara had eaten there exactly once, to understand it, and had come back more confused about the state of the world than when she'd left. Their regulars were loyal, that was something. The Kowalski brothers, who ran the garage on 5th, came in every morning and ordered the same thing without variation. Mrs. Papadakis from the dry cleaners, the nursing shift workers from Mercy General who came in tired and needed actual food and not an experience. These were her people. They'd known her father. Several of them had come to the funeral and stood awkwardly in the cold outside the church and said things like he was a good man and this place won't be the same, and Mara had thanked them and meant it. She was refilling the Kowalski brothers' coffee when the bell above the door went and Caleb Voss walked in. She knew it was him before she turned around. She knew it from the particular way the air in the room shifted. Not dramatically, not the way it did in movies, but the small, subtle way that happens when your nervous system recognizes something before your brain catches up. Some residual animal recognition. She turned around. He looked good, which was the first thing she noticed and hated herself for noticing. He'd always been good-looking in that specific way that photographs well and reads as confidence in a room. Broad-shouldered, easy smile, the kind of haircut that's casual but definitely planned. He was wearing a suit now, which was new. When she'd known him, he'd been in contractor clothes. Apparently things had changed. Mara. He said her name like it was something he was reclaiming, like it belonged to him. Caleb? She turned back to the Kowalski brothers, finished pouring, set the pot down. You want a table or you want to order at the counter? I'm not here to eat. Then I'm going to need you to step outside. Counter space is for paying customers. She heard one of the Kowalski brothers, Martin, the older one, make a low sound into his coffee cup. Approval, probably. The Kowalski brothers had strong opinions about men who showed up uninvited. Caleb moved to the far end of the counter, away from them, and lowered his voice. I heard about your dad. I'm sorry. Thank you. You can send a card. Mara. What do you want, Caleb? A pause. He rearranged his expression. She'd watched him do that 100 times, the almost imperceptible shift when he remembered how he'd planned to play something. I work for Victor Kessler now. I'm part of his development team. I know who you work for. Then you know what he's offering is fair. More than fair, actually. The property is not for sale. The property is assessed at not for sale. He stopped, looked at her. That particular look she remembered, the one that was almost patient, almost sympathetic, that contained underneath it a very complete contempt. You can't afford to run this place, Mara. You've been running on fumes for 2 years. Your father was running on fumes before that. Victor is offering you a way out that actually, a way out. She said it flat. Is that what it is? A fresh start. Seriously, the money would... Get out of my diner. Mara, I said get out of my diner, Caleb. Her voice didn't waver. She was extraordinarily proud of her voice in that moment. And tell whoever sent you that the answer is no. Tell Kessler, tell whoever. Write it down if it helps. The answer is no. The Kowalski brothers were no longer pretending to drink their coffee. Caleb straightened, put his easy smile back on, the one that was mostly edge. You were always like this, he said. You know that? You were always... He made a gesture, vague and dismissive. This, like everything's a fight, like if you don't make it hard, it doesn't count. Mara picked up the coffee pot, looked at him. Door's right there. He went. But he went slowly, the way people do when they want you to know that leaving was their choice. When the bell above the door jangled shut, Martin Kowalski cleared his throat and said, without looking up from his cup, "That your ex?" "Yeah." "He always that bad?" Mara thought about it honestly. "He got worse." Martin made the same sound as before. "Usually how it goes." Sam. She spent the rest of the morning moving. That was the only strategy she had left. Keep moving. Don't think too long about any one thing. Keep your hands doing something so your head doesn't have room to spiral. She prepped the lunch service. She called the refrigeration repair company about the unit that had been making a sound like an elderly engine for 2 weeks. She returned 3 emails from vendors. She ate half a slice of toast at 10:30, standing over the sink, and called it breakfast. At 11:15, her stepmother called. Mara let it go to voicemail. At 11:40, Diane called again. Mara sent it to voicemail again. At noon, Diane walked in. She was a narrow-shouldered woman in her late 50s who had always dressed like someone about to attend a function that was slightly more important than whatever was actually happening. Today it was a cream blouse, pressed slacks, low heels. Her hair was the same careful silver it had been for as long as Mara could remember. She looked like a person who had decided grief was a scheduling inconvenience and worked around it. She sat at the counter. She looked around the diner with the particular expression of someone who has already decided what something is worth and doesn't think much of the number. "I'm not discussing the property," Mara said before she could open her mouth. "I haven't said anything." "You don't need to. I know why you're here." Diane folded her hands on the counter. "Your father made provisions, Mara. I didn't write the will." "No, he did. During a period when he thought—" She stopped, reset. "He's not here to explain what he thought, and I'm not going to guess at it. The clause exists. I'm addressing it." Something shifted in Diane's expression. "You found someone." Mara said nothing. "Who?" And then, when Mara still didn't answer, "You have 48 hours. Whoever this is, whatever you're planning, it won't hold. Victor's lawyers have already—" "I need you to leave now, Diane." "Mara, be practical. The offer on the table is—" "I need you to leave my diner." She said it quietly. Not aggressively, just with the weight of something that had been decided. "Please." Diane left. But not before setting a business card on the counter to Victor Kessler's card, Mara noticed, with a handwritten number on the back that she didn't look at and turned face down without picking up. He came in at 9:17 that night. She heard the bell, didn't look up from the coffee machine she was cleaning, but she tracked him by sound. The particular cadence of his steps, the specific scrape of the corner booth chair on tile, and she was already pouring before he settled in. She brought the coffee over. He was already reading. She set the cup down. He looked up, briefly, and there was something in his expression that she might have called recognition, except that she still didn't know enough about him to say what he was recognizing. "Thank you," he said. "Cherry pie tonight?" "Please." She went back behind the counter, cut the pie, brought it over. He was reading again. She stood beside the table for a moment, not because she needed to, but because she needed to say it out loud, needed to make it real. "Yesterday, what I asked you." She kept her voice low. Danny was in the back. She didn't know why that mattered, but it did. "I need you to understand what you actually agreed to." He set the book down, full attention, just like that. "I need you to understand that the people trying to take this place have lawyers, real lawyers, not the overworked solo practitioner I can afford. Victor Kessler is not a small operator, and my ex, Caleb—" She paused. "He came in this morning. He's working for Kessler, which means the marriage will be scrutinized. They'll look for any reason to call it invalid. We'd have to be convincing." "Yes." He considered this, picked up his fork, cut a piece of pie. "Have you been married before?" "No." "Engaged?" "Once." She paused. "To Caleb." He ate the pie, didn't comment on that. Then, "How long has the diner been yours?" "Not legally, actually." The question surprised her enough that she answered it honestly. "Since I was about 12. My dad used to bring me in on Saturday mornings to help with the rush. I've been working here full-time since I was 19. And your father built it." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, rain had started. Not heavy, just the thin, persistent kind that you don't notice until you're already wet. "What do you need from me before Friday?" he asked. Mara exhaled. It came out shakier than she'd intended. "I need to go to the county clerk's office tomorrow morning for the license. There's a 72-hour waiver for extenuating circumstances, which I've already filed for. I did that yesterday before I—" She stopped, started again. "Before I talk to you, I need you to be there, and I need your real name." "Lucian Riva," he said. "Lucian with a C." She repeated it in her head. "Lucian Riva." It sat in her mouth like something from a different country. "Do you have ID? They'll need—" "I'll have what we need." She believed him, which should have been more alarming than it was. There was something about the way he said it, not boastful, not vague, just factual, that made disbelief feel like extra work she didn't have the energy for. "I should tell you," he said, and his voice shifted very slightly, a register she hadn't heard before, something more deliberate, "that I have some complications to my situation. Nothing that would affect the legality, but things that may become apparent over the next few days. I want you to know that going in." Mara stared at him. "What kind of complications?" He looked at her steadily. "The kind I'm not ready to explain tonight." She should have pressed. She knew she should have pressed. Later, she would think about this moment and understand that this was the place where a different version of herself, a more cautious one, a smarter one, would have said, "Then I need to know before I agree to anything more," and meant it. Instead, she heard herself say, "Okay," just that. One word. And she meant it, which was the part that didn't make sense, except that she was 28 years old and exhausted, and the thing she was trying to save was worth more to her than her own caution. He nodded, picked up his book again. Then, without looking up, "Wear something you'd be comfortable being photographed in. Tomorrow, for the clerk. It's not a real— it's a legal document with witnesses," he said quietly. "Treat it like it matters, because it does." She went back behind the counter. She stood there for a long time after Danny left, after the last lights were down, after Lucian Riva had paid his bill in cash— he always paid in cash— and folded his reading lamp back into the bag he carried it in and walked out into the rain without a jacket, which she noticed and said nothing about. She stood in the quiet of the diner and she pressed both hands flat on the counter and she felt the grain of the wood through her palms, the worn surface of it, the place where her father had put a small gouge with a key years ago and she'd always meant to fill it and never had. She thought, "Ray Ellison, what were you thinking?" And then she thought, "He was thinking about me. That's the terrible part. He was always thinking about me." Quote. The county clerk's office opened at 8:30. Mara was there at 8:22 in a green dress she'd bought 2 years ago for a friend's birthday party and worn twice. It was not a wedding dress. It was a dress that said, "I am taking this seriously without pretending it is something it isn't," and that felt honest enough to stand in. Lucien was already there. He was standing slightly away from the entrance, in a dark jacket, watching the door. The way people watch things when they're cataloging information rather than simply waiting. He saw her and straightened slightly, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the 20 feet of municipal sidewalk between them, and Mara had the sudden violent understanding that this was actually happening. He crossed to her. "You came," she said. And then hated herself immediately, because of course he had. He'd said he would, and she sounded like someone who expected to be abandoned because she had learned to. "I said I would. Not unkind, just true." He held the door. Inside, the fluorescent government building light was its own specific kind of merciless. Everything looked too ordinary for the size of what was happening. Forms on a counter. A woman with reading glasses and the expression of someone who had processed 500 of these and would process 500 more. A pen on a chain. They stood at the counter. The clerk, her lanyard said Helen, looked at them, looked at the paperwork Mara set down, looked at the waiver form, looked at Lucien. Then she looked at Lucien again. Something small happened in her expression. A flicker. Something almost like recognition, quickly suppressed. She looked back at the forms. ID? Mara produced her license. Lucien produced a passport, which Helen looked at for slightly longer than Mara thought was normal, then stamped, then set back down without comment. They filled out the forms. Mara's handwriting was terrible because her hands weren't quite steady. She signed her name 3 times in 3 different places, and each time she wrote Ellison, she felt it shift in her chest, the weight of what she was about to change it to. Riva. Mara Riva. She wrote it experimentally, privately, in her head, and immediately stopped because that was not a useful direction. The ceremony will need a licensed officiant, Helen said, not looking up from the forms. You have until Friday at 5. We have a list of registered officiants on the website, or you can use your own. Thank you, Lucien said. Helen stamped the paperwork, slid it across the counter, and then she did something Mara didn't expect. She looked at Mara directly, with the specific look of someone who is deciding whether to say something. She didn't say it, but the look stayed with Mara as they walked back out into the morning air, the paperwork folded in her hand, the whole impossible machinery of it now in motion. What was that? Mara asked once they were clear of the entrance. When she looked at you. She was being careful, Lucien said. About what? He glanced at her, the same steady, contained expression. The light was better out here, and she could see his face clearly, the particular quality of his stillness, the way he held himself like someone who had decided long ago that stillness was its own form of armor. My name means something in certain rooms, he said. That's one of the complications I mentioned. Mara stopped walking. He stopped too. What does your name mean? She said. Not a question, a demand. The first one she'd made since this started. He looked at her for a long moment. The morning traffic moved around them. A bus, 2 cyclists, a delivery truck making its slow corner, and none of it touched what was happening in the 4 feet between them on that sidewalk. Nothing that threatens you, he said, and nothing that will make what we're doing less legal. That's not what I asked. No, he agreed. It isn't. She looked at him. He looked back. And she could see it now. Whatever it was, she'd been too tired and too desperate to notice before. Something in the way he occupied space. Something that wasn't threat exactly, but was adjacent to it. The way a storm is adjacent to weather. Lucien, she said. His name, for the first time. It landed between them with more weight than she expected. Before Friday, I need to know what I'm walking into. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Friday, he said, come to the diner at 8. I'll be there. And I'll tell you what you need to know before we sign anything. She stared at him. You're asking me to wait until Friday morning? The ceremony is at 9, he said. That gives us an hour. An hour. An hour is more than most people get. And there was something in his voice, not bitterness, not quite, just the particular weight of someone who knows what they're talking about from experience. Mara stood on that sidewalk with the marriage license in her hand, and the diner 2 blocks west and 46 hours left before everything either was saved or wasn't, and she thought about her father, who had committed fully and without reservation to every stupid, beautiful thing he'd ever believed in, and she thought, fine. Friday, 1 hour. She turned and walked back toward the diner without saying goodbye, because she needed to be moving, and she was already late for the lunch service, and she was not going to cry on a public sidewalk over a marriage that hadn't happened yet. Behind her she heard nothing. No footsteps. No voice. No car door. Just the city. Doing what cities do, and Mara Ellison doing what she'd always done. Moving forward into the thing she was afraid of, because stopping was the only option she'd already crossed off the list. Mata. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, standing on that sidewalk with the license folded in her hand and her back to him, was that Lucien Riva had pulled out his phone before she'd made it half a block, had made a call, had said 3 words into it quietly, in a language that was not English. And on the other end of that call, something had shifted, something that had been still began to move, something that had been watching from a distance began to close in, not toward Mara, not yet, but toward the man who had walked into her diner that morning with the easy smile and the new suit, toward Caleb Voss. And everything he didn't know was coming. The call Lucien made lasted 40 seconds. Mara didn't know that. She was already half a block away, her shoulders set against the morning wind, the marriage license folded into a square small enough to fit in her coat pocket. She didn't look back. She had decided not to look back, and she was keeping that decision the same way she kept most decisions, by refusing to examine it too closely once it was made. The diner was open when she got there. Danny had unlocked at 6:30 as always, and the lunch prep was halfway done, and Mrs. Papadakis was in her usual booth with her usual tea and her usual newspaper, and the Kowalski brothers were gone, but they'd left a $5 tip, which was generous for 2 coffees, and maybe Mara's voice the morning before had registered somewhere good. She put on her apron. She washed her hands. She started moving. That was Wednesday. By Wednesday afternoon, Kessler's people had called twice. Not Caleb, someone else. A woman with a pleasant professional voice and the clipped cadence of someone reading from a script. The offer, she said, remained on the table. Mr. Kessler was a reasonable man. He understood the emotional complexity of these situations. He was prepared to accommodate a flexible timeline. Mara listened to both voicemails in full, standing in the back office with the door closed. Then she deleted them. Then she sat down on the cot and put her face in her hands and stayed like that for about 90 seconds. Not crying, not thinking, just being a body in a room that needed a moment to be a body in a room before it had to be a person again. 90 seconds. She'd gotten good at rationing herself. She got up, went back to the floor. The afternoon service needed her, and need was the clearest directive she had. Lucien came in at his usual time, 9:14. She didn't check the clock, but she felt it. The particular drop in ambient noise when the door opened, the specific quality of his footsteps, the corner booth chair. She brought the coffee without being asked. He had the book again, different one tonight, same language. She stood at his table. "Tomorrow," she said. He looked up. "I know. 8 o'clock. I'll be here." She'd intended to say more, had rehearsed several things on the walk from the counter, reasonable, measured things about what she needed from him, about the ceremony logistics, about the fact that she'd hired an officiant through the county's listed registrants, and it would cost $240 she didn't entirely have. But standing here with him looking at her with that particular quality of attention, the rehearsed things felt thin. "Why did you say yes?" she asked instead. He didn't answer immediately. That was one of his consistent qualities. He didn't fill silence reflexively, the way most people did. He let it sit, which was uncomfortable and also oddly respectful, like he thought what she'd asked deserved real consideration before an answer. "Because you asked," he said finally. "That's not enough." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He looked at his coffee cup, then back at her. "You're the first person in this city who's talked to me like I'm just a man sitting in a diner. Not because you didn't notice the rest, but because you decided it wasn't your business." A pause. "I noticed that." Mara processed this. "That's a strange reason to agree to a legal marriage." "Yes. It doesn't explain anything." "No," he said again. "It doesn't." And the way he said it was almost an apology, except that it was also a wall, and she could see the wall clearly enough to know that pushing it tonight wasn't going to accomplish anything. She went back to the counter. She tried not to think about what he'd said or what it meant or why it sat in her chest, in the specific place that things sit when they matter more than they should. She failed at all 3. Thursday morning arrived with a text from a number she didn't recognize. "The offer expires Friday at noon. After that, we proceed with the legal process. V. Kessler." She stared at it for a long time. Legal process. Like there was some mechanism already in motion, like the timeline was his to control. She put the phone face down. At 9:45, Caleb came back. She was ready for him this time, or thought she was. But he didn't come in aggressive. He came in careful, which was worse, because careful Caleb was the one she'd spent 3 years learning to work around. Aggressive Caleb was easy. Careful Caleb knew where the pressure points were and applied himself to them slowly, like someone tuning an instrument. He sat at the counter, ordered coffee, which meant he intended to stay long enough to justify occupying a stool. Danny was watching from the kitchen window. She could see him in her peripheral vision, pretending to wipe down the pass-through. "I'm not going to push," Caleb said. He wrapped both hands around the mug, didn't drink from it. "I just want to talk." "We don't have anything to talk about." "I think we do." His voice was low, reasonable, calibrated. "Mara, look. I know things ended badly between us. That's on both of us. I know that. But this, he gestured vaguely, encompassing the diner, the situation, presumably her entire life. This is you being stubborn about something you can't actually afford to be stubborn about, and I don't want to watch you lose everything because I'm what? A beat. Because you'd rather fight than accept help. She refilled his coffee cup, slowly, deliberately, gave herself the 4 seconds that took. The last time you offered me help, she said, you emptied half our joint savings account and called it a misunderstanding. His jaw tightened, just slightly. That was $3,200, Caleb. I have the bank statements. That was a complicated... I'm not complicated, she said. The answer was no on Monday. It was no yesterday. It's no this morning. She set the coffee pot down, met his eyes. Finish the coffee, leave a tip, and don't come back in here again. I mean it. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see it happening, the recalibration, the shift from careful to something else. Something that dropped the pretense of concern and let the rest show through. You know what your problem is? He said, and his voice was still low, but the reasonableness was gone. You think this place means something. You think because your dad built it, because you've worked yourself half to death here, that it matters, that it's worth fighting for. He shook his head. It's a diner, Mara. It's a 40-seat diner on a street that's going to be redeveloped whether you sell or not. The only difference is whether you get anything for it. She said nothing. He left you a losing hand, Caleb said. Your dad. I know that's hard to hear, but it's true. And this, he gestured again. This marriage thing, whatever you're planning, it won't hold. Victor's people are very good at finding reasons why things don't hold. Mara picked up the coffee pot, looked at him. You told me once, she said, that I'd never be chosen. You remember that? He blinked. I don't. You do. She kept her voice flat. Not angry, just factual. November, 3 years ago. You said I was the kind of woman men appreciated but didn't choose. You said it like it was feedback. She set the pot down. I thought about that for a long time. I'd like you to know that. Something moved across his face. She chose to believe it was shame, even though she couldn't be sure. Get out, she said. He left. Danny came out of the kitchen approximately 4 seconds later with the specific expression of someone who had heard everything and was exerting extraordinary self-control. You okay? He said. Mostly. She started wiping down the counter, the section where Caleb had been sitting. Danny, if he comes in again, I'll tell him the kitchen's on fire. Danny picked up a rag. Or something more convincing. She managed something that was almost a smile. It lasted about as long as those things tend to last. Thursday afternoon, she got a call from Gerald Holt. She almost didn't pick up because Gerald Holt's calls had been uniformly terrible since the funeral. But she picked up this time because she needed to know if there was anything new and terrible to prepare for. There was. Diane's attorney has filed a motion to contest the waiver, Gerald said. He had the voice of a man who had been awake since 5 and had already delivered 3 pieces of bad news before noon. The grounds are technical. They're arguing the clerk's office shouldn't have granted it without additional documentation. Mara leaned against the wall of the back office. The cot was behind her and she very much wanted to lie down on it. Can they do that? They filed it. Whether it holds is a different question. The county clerk will review it. It could take time we don't have. How much time? Possibly past Friday. A pause. I'm working on it. But Mara, I want to be honest with you. This is a well-resourced opposition. Kessler's legal team is... I know. Your position depends on the marriage being recorded before any court order can... I know, Gerald. She pressed her palm flat against the wall. Felt the plaster, old and slightly soft in the way of old buildings that have absorbed too many years. What's the earliest the ceremony can happen? Legally? Tomorrow morning, once the clerk's office opens at 8:30 and processes the final license. I have an officiant booked at 9. That might be cutting it close. Then I'll make it fast. Gerald made the sound he made when he was trying to manage his own anxiety about a situation. If the marriage is on record before any injunction is issued, the property transfer is moot. That's your window. It's narrow. I've been working with narrow, she said. Thank you, Gerald. She hung up. She sat on the cot. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, hard enough to see geometric shapes, and breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth, 1, 2, 3, 4, the way she'd taught herself to do at 19 when the first real adult fear had arrived and she'd realized nobody was going to teach her how to handle it. 36 hours. Maybe less if Diane's attorney moved fast. She got up, went back to the floor. The dinner service needed her, and need was still the clearest directive she had. He came in at 9. She was watching the door by 8:55, which she refused to analyze. He sat down. She brought the coffee. No book tonight. He set both hands flat on the table and looked at her when she approached and didn't look away. "Sit down," he said. Danny can handle it for 10 minutes. He said it quietly, but it wasn't quite a request. "Sit down, Mara." She sat. He looked at her for a moment, reading something in her face that she hadn't explicitly put there, or maybe that she had and hadn't meant to. "Tell me what happened today," he said. She told him. The motion to contest the waiver, Gerald's window, Caleb's visit. She said it plainly, factually, in the order it had happened, the same way she'd cataloged disasters since she was old enough to understand that panicking about them didn't help. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The motion will be withdrawn," he said. She stared at him. "You don't know, so it will be withdrawn." Something in his voice. Not arrogance. Something quieter and more certain than arrogance. "By morning. Don't check your phone tonight. Check it when you wake up." She kept staring. "Lucien, what does that mean?" "It means the window will still be open tomorrow." "How do you know that?" He met her eyes, held them, and for the first time she saw it clearly. Not glimpsed it, not felt it at the edges. Saw it directly. The thing that had always been there underneath the contained stillness and the black coffee and the corner booth. Something that did not live in ordinary rooms. Something that moved in spaces she didn't have maps for. "Because I made a call," he said. The diner was quiet around them. Danny was in the back. Mrs. Papadakis had left an hour ago. The fluorescent tube had finally died, and Mara had replaced it that afternoon, and the new one was too bright, still burning off its newness. "A call," she repeated. "Yes." "To who?" "To someone who has influence over the attorney Diane retained." He said it simply, no embellishment, no apology. Mara sat very still. She was aware of her own breathing, aware of the table between them and the 4 inches of air between her forearms and the edge of it. "You have influence," she said carefully, "over an attorney you've never met." "I have influence over several people I've never personally met," he said. "That's what my name means in certain rooms. That's the complication I mentioned." She looked at him. He looked back. "I need to know what you are," she said. "Right now, not tomorrow morning, now." He was quiet for a long moment. "I am not police," he said. "I am not government. I am not—" A pause, like he was choosing the word carefully. "I don't deal in violence for its own sake. I deal in leverage, information, the movement of influence from one position to another." He held her gaze. "I occupy a position in this city that most people don't know exists and wouldn't want to." Mara's hands were flat on the table. She didn't move them. "The developer," she said. "Kessler. Do you know him?" "I know of him." "Is that why you—" She stopped. Something cold moving through her chest now. Something that reorganized the last 4 days into a different shape. "Is the diner why you've been coming here every night? Did someone send you? Did Kessler—" "No." His voice was sharp. Just that one word. Sharper than anything she'd heard from him, and the sharpness was its own kind of information. "No, I found this place on my own. I came back because—" He stopped, pressed his jaw together. "Because it was the first place in 2 years that felt like it had nothing to do with any of it. Because you made coffee and didn't ask me anything, and that was—" He stopped again. "That was what?" she asked. "Rare," he said. "That was very rare." The fluorescent light hummed. Outside the rain came back, light and insistent. "If I marry you," Mara said. She kept her voice level through an act of will she would not examine later. "My life becomes adjacent to yours. Whatever this is, the leverage, the influence, the rooms with the name in them, that comes with it. Yes. You could have told me this before the county clerk. I know. Why didn't you? He looked at her, and she could see it. The first real crack in the containment. Something that wasn't quite regret and wasn't quite guilt, but was in the neighborhood of both. Because I thought you'd say no, he said, and I didn't want you to say no. The honest admission landed between them like something dropped. Mara held it. She thought about her father, who had committed fully and without reservation to every stupid, beautiful thing he'd ever believed in, and she thought about the diner and the water stain on the back office ceiling, shaped like a dog with a broken ear, and the gouge in the counter from the key, and 36 hours, and Gerald Holt's careful voice and Caleb's face when she'd reminded him what he'd said. Tomorrow, she said. 8 o'clock. You're here. I'll be here. And you tell me everything before we sign. Yes. She stood up, looked at him one more time. This man she'd asked to marry her because she had no one else, and who had said yes for reasons that were still only partially visible, who had made a call and moved an attorney like a piece on a board, who drank black coffee and read Italian novels and had lived for months 30 feet from her life without once intruding on it. Don't be late, she said. She went back to the counter. She did not look at her phone that night. In the morning, when she checked it, the motion had been withdrawn, and Caleb Voss, she would learn only later, had received a visit that night at his apartment. Not violent, not threatening, just two men in good suits who had asked him a number of questions about his employer and his past and the $3,200 in November, and who had explained very calmly that his continued presence in Mara Ellison's business interests would be inadvisable going forward. Caleb had called Kessler at midnight in a cold sweat, and Kessler, for the first time, had felt the first small thread of unease, the kind that arrives before the unraveling and is easy to dismiss until you realize. Friday arrived the way days do when you've been waiting for them too long. Not with drama, but with the flat, gray ordinariness of a morning that doesn't know it's supposed to mean something. Mara was up at 5:43. She hadn't set an alarm. Her body had simply decided that sleep was finished, the way it does when something is coming, and the nervous system refuses to pretend otherwise. She lay on the cot for approximately 90 seconds, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, the dog with the broken ear, and then she got up, because lying there was just fear with her eyes open. She showered in the diner's narrow back bathroom, the one her father had installed for employees and which had water pressure that was either scalding or glacial with nothing in between. This morning it ran cold, and she let it. It helped. The cold helped her locate herself in her body, which was somewhere she'd been having trouble staying lately. She put on the red dress. She hadn't planned the red dress. She'd laid out the green one, the same green one from the county clerk, the one that said, "I am taking this seriously," without pretending it is something it isn't. But when she'd looked at it this morning, she'd thought about Caleb's face when he'd said she'd never be chosen, and she'd put the green one back and taken the red one from the back of the closet where it had been hanging since her friend Dara's wedding 2 years ago. Red was not a practical color for a courthouse marriage between two people who barely knew each other. That was exactly why she put it on. She was behind the counter at 6:30, apron over the dress, because the diner still needed opening whether or not the rest of her life was in the process of being decided. Danny came in, looked at the dress beneath the apron, looked at her face, said nothing, which was the correct response. They opened. The morning regulars came. Mrs. Papadakis with her tea. The nursing shift. 2 construction workers from the site 3 blocks east who'd been coming in for a month and always ordered the same: eggs over hard, white toast, black coffee, and who Mara had started recognizing as constants in the way you recognize streetlights. Reliably there without requiring acknowledgement. She moved through the service automatically, took orders, poured coffee, made change, smiled at Mrs. Papadakis because Mrs. Papadakis was 81 years old and had lost her husband in March, and came in every morning partly for the tea and partly for the human contact. And Mara understood that about her, and it cost nothing to smile. 7:45. She took off the apron, washed her hands, told Danny she'd be back by 10 and to call her if anything burned down in the literal sense. "Only the literal sense?" Danny said. "Use your judgment on the rest," she said, and walked out the front door into the morning. Lucien was already there. He was in the corner booth without the reading lamp, without the book, just sitting with both hands around the coffee cup she'd left for him. She'd poured it before she'd left, set it at his table, some automatic gesture she hadn't thought about until she was already outside. His jacket was dark. His shirt was white. He looked like a man who had dressed for something he intended to take seriously. She slid into the seat across from him. He looked at her, really looked, the way he always did, with that quality of attention that felt like being the only thing in the room. His eyes moved briefly to the red dress, then back to her face. 8 o'clock, she said. 8 o'clock, he confirmed. She put both hands flat on the table. Tell me. He didn't preface it, didn't warm into it. That was one of the things she'd come to understand about him. He didn't use words to manage distance. When he spoke, he meant it. My father built something, he said. Not a business, not exactly. A system of relationships, financial, political, structural, that operates in the spaces between legitimate institutions. He built it over 30 years. When he died, it came to me. Mara kept her eyes on his. What kind of system? The kind that keeps certain things moving. Supply chains that official channels can't manage. Information that changes hands between people who can't be seen exchanging it. Debts that exist in no ledger. He paused. I didn't build it. I inherited it. There's a difference that matters to me even if it doesn't matter to the law. Does the law know about it? Parts of it. I have an arrangement. He said arrangement the way people say words that are standing in for more complicated words. I am not currently a target of any investigation. What I do exists in a category that is tolerated, contingent on certain behaviors. Mara breathed in, breathed out. And Kessler. Kessler is not in my category, Lucian said. He is a legitimate developer who uses illegitimate methods. He acquires properties in specific corridors, not randomly. He's working with 2 city council members who have agreed to accelerate zoning changes in exchange for a portion of the development profits. The diner's block is part of a planned corridor that, once complete, will generate approximately $40 million in tax increment financing. She stared at him. My father's diner is part of a $40 million corridor. Your father's diner is the last property on that block that he doesn't own, Lucian said. Without it, the corridor has a gap. Without the gap filled, the zoning change doesn't have the contiguous footprint it needs. Without the footprint, the financing falls apart. He held her gaze. Your diner is the keystone. Kessler needs it the way a bridge needs its centerstone. Remove it and the whole structure loses integrity. The weight of that settled on her slowly, like water finding the low points. He knew, she said. He's known the whole time that it wasn't about the diner being worth. The offer he made you was a fraction of what the property is actually worth to him. Yes. Her jaw tightened. And the will, the clause. Did he? I don't know if Kessler had any involvement in your father's will. Lucian's voice was careful here, precise. I don't know that. What I know is that Diane was approached by Kessler's team approximately 6 weeks before your father died, and that she signed a preliminary letter of intent to sell 2 days after the funeral. Silence. The diner was quiet around them. Danny was in the kitchen. The last of the morning regulars had filtered out. In 20 minutes, Mara needed to be walking toward the county clerk's office for a 9 o'clock ceremony that would determine whether she kept the keystone or lost it. 2 days after the funeral, she repeated. Yes, something moved through her chest. Not grief exactly. Grief had already been there. Grief had been the baseline for 3 weeks. This was something else. Something that sat underneath grief and was uglier. The specific pain of understanding that the thing you thought was random was actually designed, that the wall you walked into in the dark was put there on purpose. My father, she said, and stopped. Because she didn't know how to finish that sentence, because finishing it required her to decide what she believed about a dead man who couldn't explain himself, and she wasn't ready to do that in the next 8 minutes. Lucien didn't push. He waited. If we go through with this, she said, if we sign, if the property is protected. She looked at him steadily. What happens to Kessler? Nothing immediate, he said. The corridor fails without your property. He absorbs the loss. The council members become a liability instead of an asset. That tends to resolve itself. And the council members. That's already in motion. She stared at him. I made some calls Wednesday, he said. The motion withdrawal was one result. The council member's exposure is another. Mara felt something she couldn't immediately name, Not fear, not gratitude. Something that lived between them. The understanding that she had married, or was about to marry, a man who moved things she couldn't see from positions she didn't have access to, and that this was both the reason she was still standing and the thing she hadn't fully agreed to. "You started this before I agreed to anything," she said. "Yes." "Before the county clerk?" "Yes." She held his gaze. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The quietness had a shape to it now. She was learning to read his silences the way you learn to read weather, not perfectly, but well enough. "Because you weren't going to ask for help," he said, "and you needed it, and He stopped. "I had the capacity to provide it." "That's not a complete answer." "No," he said, "it isn't." She looked at him across the table in the early morning light of the diner that smelled like her father and coffee and the particular old building smell of places that have absorbed decades of the same lives, and she made a decision. Not the marriage decision. That was already made, had been made when she'd slid that note across the counter 4 days ago. This was a different decision, the decision about what the marriage was actually going to mean. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She stood, untied the apron she'd forgotten she was still wearing, folded it over the back of the booth. "We need to walk. It's 8:12. He stood, reached into his jacket pocket and left cash on the table. For the coffee, for the pie from the previous nights, she thought, and almost said something about it and didn't. They walked out of the diner together into the Friday morning. The ceremony took 11 minutes. The officiant was a woman named Patricia who had done this 240 times and had the manner of someone who understood that the legal and the emotional were not always the same event and had made her peace with that. She did not perform the ceremony. She administered it. There was a difference, and Mara was grateful for it. The witnesses were a clerk named Mohammed, who worked at the county office, and a woman named Sandra, who Patricia apparently kept on retainer for exactly this purpose, and who smelled like lavender and had very kind eyes. Lucian signed with a steady hand. Mara signed with a hand that was almost steady. Patricia said the words. They said the words back. There was no music. There was fluorescent lighting and a particle board table and the distant sound of a phone ringing somewhere in the building. At 9:11, it was done. Mara Ellison looked at the certificate in her hand, at her name on it, at his name beside hers. She didn't cry. She had been afraid she'd cry and she didn't, which felt like a small victory in a morning that needed whatever victories it could find. Lucien looked at her. "Okay," she said again. It seemed to be the only word that fit. "Okay," he said. They walked out. The ownership meeting was at 2 o'clock. Kessler's offices were on the 14th floor of a building downtown that had the architecture of a place that wanted you to feel small before you got to the elevator. Mara had been told about the meeting by Gerald Holt at 11:30. Diane's attorney had requested it, framing it as a final administrative step, and Gerald had advised her to attend with documentation. She arrived at 1:55 with the marriage certificate, the property deed, Gerald Holt at her left elbow, and the particular quality of calm that arrives when you have already done the hardest thing and everything else is just paperwork. The conference room was on the 14th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a table that cost more than 3 months of the diner's revenue. Diane at the far end, in the same cream blouse, with an expression Mara recognized as the one she wore when she believed the outcome was already settled. 2 attorneys flanking her. A man Mara had never seen in person, but recognized from the photo on his company website. Victor Kessler. Compact, silver-haired, the easy authority of a man who had won enough to stop worrying about the possibility of losing. And Caleb, standing to Kessler's right, not sitting, standing like he needed to be ready to move, looking at Mara with an expression that contained, underneath its surface neutrality, something that was almost pity. She walked in. Gerald walked in. She put her bag on the table and sat down. Kessler looked at her, looked at Gerald, made a slight adjustment to his expression that was not quite a smile. "Ms. Ellison," he said, "thank you for coming. I think we can resolve this quickly." "Agreed," she said. He looked at Gerald. "I understand you've been advised about the strength of the clause. I want to be clear that we're not here to make things difficult. The offer remains fair. Given the circumstances." The door opened. Kessler stopped talking. Everyone in the room turned. Lucien walked in. He wasn't moving fast. He was moving at the same pace he moved through the diner, measured, deliberate, like a man who had decided the room's schedule was going to adjust to him rather than the other way around. He was still in the dark jacket. He'd done something with his posture that Mara couldn't quite quantify, straightened something or stopped holding something back. And the effect was that he occupied more space than his physical dimensions should have allowed. He pulled out the chair beside Mara and sat down. The temperature of the room had changed. She could feel it. Not dramatically. No one gasped, no one stood up. But something had shifted in the air, in the specific way that rooms shift when a variable enters that nobody accounted for. Kessler was looking at Lucian. Kessler's expression had not changed. That was information. Most people's expressions change when they're surprised. Kessler's hadn't, which meant he was either genuinely unaffected or he was very good at controlling his face, and Mara suspected it was the latter. One of his attorneys leaned toward him, said something low. Kessler listened without looking at the attorney, which was also information. "I don't believe we've met," Kessler said. "No," Lucian said. "We haven't." "And you're here in what capacity?" Lucian looked at him. That particular quality of looking, contained, direct, with nothing wasted in it. "My wife's property is not for sale." 3 words plus 4. 7 words total. Diane's face did something complicated. The attorney beside her stopped writing. Caleb, standing at Kessler's right, went very still. Kessler's eyes moved to Mara, back to Lucien. He was recalculating. She could almost see it, the specific quality of stillness in a person who is rapidly reorienting to new information. "Your wife," he said. "As of this morning," Lucien said. He placed the copy of the marriage certificate on the table. Didn't slide it, set it down. "The clause in Raymond Ellison's will has been satisfied. The property at 414 Ferris Street belongs to Mara Ellison. Any legal action against that ownership will be directed to our attorneys." He named a firm. She didn't recognize it, but one of Kessler's attorneys did. She saw it in the way he went slightly still. The room was quiet. "Victor," Caleb's voice, low and careful from his position near the window. Can we take a minute?" Kessler didn't answer him. He was still looking at Lucian. "Riva," he said. Not a question. Lucian didn't respond. Something moved across Kessler's face then. Not the controlled version, not the board meeting face. The thing underneath it. And what was underneath it was not fear exactly, but the first cousin of fear, the thing that arrives before fear when you are a man who has spent 20 years believing he operated in spaces where there were no variables he hadn't accounted for, and you discover there is one. "The offer is withdrawn," Mara said. Both of them looked at her. Kessler, Lucian. She held Kessler's gaze. In case that wasn't clear. "The offer is withdrawn. The property is not for sale at any price. And if Diane's attorney files anything further, Gerald will respond accordingly." She looked at Diane, who was looking at her hands. "I think we're done." She stood. Gerald stood. Lucien stood. And then the door opened again, and everything that had just happened in that room shattered into something different, something Mara had not anticipated and no one in that room had prepared for. A woman, 50s, sharp-faced, in a gray suit. She walked in with the specific energy of someone who had authorization to be there and knew it. She had a badge on her belt, and she set a manila envelope on the table in front of Kessler, and she said, with the flat bureaucratic courtesy of someone who has done this many times, "Mr. Kessler, I'm Special Agent Renata Walsh, Financial Crimes Division. We have some questions about the Ferris Street Corridor project and your communications with the offices of council members Briggs and Ewan." She looked around the room. Her eyes moved over Mara, over Gerald, over Lucian. And on Lucian they paused, just briefly, just a fraction of a second longer than the others. Then she looked back at Kessler. "We'd like you to come with us," she said. Kessler didn't move. Caleb had gone white. Diane was looking at the table, and Mara, standing in her red dress in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building designed to make her feel small, looked at Lucien. He was already looking at her. And she understood in the space of that look something she should have understood sooner and hadn't let herself. The calls he'd made, the motion withdrawn, the council member's exposure. the attorney firm whose name had made Kessler's lawyer flinch. This wasn't an improvisation. This wasn't a man who had made a few calls in the days since a waitress had slid a desperate note across a diner counter. This had been building for longer than she'd known him. Much longer. And the question that had been sitting in the back of her throat since the county clerk's office, the one she hadn't asked in the diner this morning because she'd been choosing the forward motion over the looking down, that question surfaced now with a cold and terrible clarity. She turned to him fully. "How long?" she said. Her voice was quiet. The room was still full of people, but she was speaking only to him. He met her eyes. "Lucien." A beat. "How long have you known about Kessler in the corridor before you ever walked into my diner?" The agent was talking to Kessler's attorney. Caleb had his phone out, pressed to the wall. Diane hadn't moved. Lucien held her gaze, and in the silence before he answered, Mara felt the floor shift beneath everything she'd built. Her understanding of the last 5 days on felt it tilt slightly, the way structures tilt when you discover that the thing you thought was foundation. He answered her. 8 months, he said. The room was still full of noise. Agent Walsh talking, Kessler's attorney on his feet. Caleb's voice tight and low into his phone in the corner. But none of it touched the 4 feet of air between Mara and Lucien. 8 months. She counted backward without meaning to. 8 months ago, she had been sleeping in her own apartment. Her father had been alive. The diner had been running at 60%, and she had considered that normal. And somewhere across the city, a man named Lucien Riva had known about 414 Ferris Street and what it meant to Victor Kessler's $40 million corridor. "You came into my diner," she said. "Yes. 8 months ago. 7.5. Because of Kessler." He held her gaze. Initially, that word, initially, she felt it land in her chest like something physical, like a step onto ice that holds and then doesn't. She looked at his face, the contained stillness, the light eyes, the particular quality of attention that she had spent weeks interpreting as something that had to do with her specifically and was now rearranging itself into something that might have had a different origin entirely. "Mara." His voice was low. The room noise hadn't diminished, but he was very focused, very precise. "I need you to hear the rest. I've heard enough." "No." Not aggressive, just certain. "You haven't." She picked up her bag from the table. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that, and also furious at herself for caring about it. Gerald was at her elbow, looking between her and Lucien with the expression of a man who has just realized he is adjacent to something significantly larger than a property dispute. "Gerald," she said, "the certificate is on record?" "Filed this morning, yes." "Then the property is secured." "Yes, but—" "Then I'll call you Monday." She looked at Lucien one last time. "Don't come to the diner tonight." She walked out. She didn't run. Running would have required her to admit that what she was doing was fleeing, and she refused that word, refused what it meant. She walked through the conference room door, past the paralegal in the hallway, who had the specific expression of someone who had heard raised voices and was pretending they hadn't, to the elevator, into the elevator. And when the doors closed, she put her back against the wall and pressed both palms flat against the cold metal surface and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. 1, 2, 3, 4. The floor numbers descended. 8 months, 7.5. Initially. The elevator reached the lobby and she walked out into Friday afternoon. She made it 4 blocks before he caught up with her. She heard him behind her, not running, but moving faster than his usual pace, that measured cadence accelerated into something with actual urgency. And she considered not stopping and then stopped because the alternative was a conversation on the move, which was worse. She turned. He was breathing harder than she'd expected. Not winded, but there was something in him that was different from the contained version she was used to, something that had come slightly loose. "You want the rest," he said. Not a question. Offering it. Putting it on the table between them on the sidewalk with the Friday traffic moving around them and the city doing what cities do. "I want the truth," she said. "All of it. Right now." He nodded, looked at the street for a moment, then back at her. "Kessler has been moving through my territory for 2 years," he said. "The corridor project crosses 3 blocks that have relationships with my operations. Not properties I own, relationships. People who depend on those blocks operating the way they've always operated. When I identified what he was building, I started tracking the properties in his path. A pause. 414 Ferris Street was the last one he needed. I looked into it. I found your father, found the diner. And the will, she said. Did you know about the clause? I found out about it 6 weeks before your father died. The same time Diane was in contact with Kessler's team. Something went cold in her. You knew my father was going to die. No. The word was hard and immediate. No, I knew he was sick. I did not know the timeline. I found out about the clause through Diane's communication with Kessler's attorney. I was monitoring that channel. He paused, pressed on. When he died, I came to the diner. I needed to see what was there, what the situation was. And what did you find? He looked at her directly. You, alone, holding it together with both hands and not asking anyone for help because you'd decided that asking was a form of losing. She said nothing. The traffic light ahead cycled. A bus exhaled. I came back, he said, not because of the corridor, because I sat in that booth and watched you work, and I thought. He stopped. Something moved across his face, something unguarded and quick that he didn't manage to contain in time. I thought you were the most stubborn, competent, completely unsupported person I'd seen in years, and I kept coming back. That's not. I know what it sounds like. It sounds like a man who surveilled my family and then inserted himself into my life under false pretenses. I didn't lie to you. You didn't tell me the truth. No, he said. I didn't. And I am not going to tell you that was a neutral decision. It wasn't. He held her gaze. Something in him that was the closest thing she'd seen to desperate. But the offer was real. The contract was real. What I said this morning about why I kept coming back, that was real. She looked at him, at this man on a Friday sidewalk in a dark jacket who had walked into her life through a back door she hadn't known existed and had been standing in it for 7.5 months, and who had moved pieces she couldn't see from positions she didn't have access to, and who had said initially in a conference room when she'd asked him why, and who was now standing on a public sidewalk with something unguarded in his face that she had never seen from him before. I have to get back to the diner, she said. Mara, I have to get back to the diner, she said again. The lunch service is over, but Danny's been there alone since 8, and I have a dinner service in 3 hours, and I need to think, and I think best when my hands are moving, so. She held his gaze. Don't come tonight. Give me that. He was quiet for a long moment. Okay, he said. She turned, walked. She did not look back. She was getting better at that. The dinner service was relentless in the way she needed it to be. 6 o'clock, the tables filled. The Kowalski brothers. The nursing shift. 4 people she didn't recognize. Tourists, maybe, or people from the new neighborhood east who'd wandered far enough to find them. Danny was in the kitchen running at full capacity, and she was front of house alone, and there was no space in it for anything except the work. She took orders. She poured coffee. She carried plates and made change and answered Mrs. Papadakis' questions about the special and refilled water glasses, and did all of it with her body while her mind did the thing it did when she gave it problem to work on in the background. Turned it over, looked at the angles, tested the weight of it. 8 months. She kept landing on that. Not on the betrayal of it, exactly. Or not only that, on the shape of it. On the image of a man she hadn't known existed sitting in her corner booth for the first time 7.5 months ago, watching her work and coming back again. Night after night, black coffee and cherry pie, Italian novels, and a reading lamp he brought himself, and never once asking her anything she didn't want to answer. You're the first person in this city who's talked to me like I'm just a man sitting in a diner. She slammed a plate down on the pass-through harder than she meant to. Danny looked up. She shook her head. He went back to the grill. The thing she kept turning over, the thing she couldn't put down, wasn't the surveillance. It wasn't the corridor or Kessler or the 7.5 months of information asymmetry. It was the note. The specific fact that when she had written that note and slid it across the counter to him, he had already known. He'd known about the will, the clause, Kessler, all of it. And he had looked at her desperate handwriting and said, Friday. I can do Friday. And he had not, at that moment or any moment since, used what he knew to steer her toward anything that wasn't her own choice. That was the thing she couldn't place, couldn't categorize. She was still turning it over at 8:45 when the front door opened and Victor Kessler walked in. Not alone. Two men behind him. Not Kessler's usual type, not attorneys, not the chrome and glass world he operated in. These two were something else, something that had an outdoor quality, a stillness that was the watchful kind. The diner went quiet, not dramatically, not all at once. But table by table, the ambient conversation softened, the way it does when something enters a room that doesn't belong in it. Kessler sat at the counter. The two men stayed near the door. Mara walked to the counter. She set her hands on the surface, the worn wood, the gouge from her father's key. She looked at Kessler. "We're closing," she said. "You close at 10. Tonight we're closing early." He looked at her. Up close, he was older than she'd registered in the conference room. Something about the afternoon light, or maybe something about the afternoon's events had taken something out of him. But his eyes were steady. This was not a man in collapse. This was a man making adjustments. "The federal thing is manageable," he said, not defensively. As a fact, delivered flatly. "I've had federal interest before. It resolves." "Congratulations. Briggs and Ewan are more of a problem," he continued, "but again, manageable." He looked at her steadily. "What isn't manageable is the property situation. With the marriage, which I admit I underestimated, I'll give you that, the legal route to the corridor is blocked." A pause. "So I'm here to have a different conversation. We don't have anything to talk about." "The marriage is legal," Kessler said, like she hadn't spoken. "I accept that. But legal and permanent aren't the same thing. Your husband," he said the word with a specific quality, a slight emphasis that was almost respectful. "Your husband and I operate in adjacent spaces. I know what his name means. I've always known. Which means I also know that what he built doesn't survive exposure. And the federal inquiry that started today, if it expands, his arrangement becomes significantly less stable." Mara didn't move. "I'm not threatening," Kessler said. "I want to be clear about that. I am describing a reality. His position depends on a certain equilibrium. That equilibrium is currently disrupted, and if he becomes a variable that federal investigators find interesting—" "Get out of my diner," she said. "Mara." He said her name the way Caleb used to, like ownership. "I can restructure. I can work around the Ferris Street gap if I have to. It costs me, but I can. What I'm offering you is a clean exit from a situation that is going to become complicated in ways you are not equipped to navigate. The money is not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" She looked at him, at this man in his good suit at her father's counter with his two outdoor quality men near her door, and she felt something that wasn't fear, something past fear, something that had burned through fear on the other side and come out as pure, clean anger. "My father built this place," she said. "He built it with $14,000 and a second mortgage and 30 years of 5 a.m. mornings. He made bad decisions and good ones, and he loved this place the way some people love something that costs them everything and is worth it anyway. And you looked at it as a gap in a footprint, a missing piece of a financing structure." She held his gaze. "So no, it's not about the money. It's about the fact that this place is not a gap. It's not a problem in your corridor. It's a diner on Ferris Street that makes eggs and coffee and that my father built, and it is not for sale." Kessler was quiet. One of the men near the door shifted his weight. The Kowalski brothers, Mara noticed in her peripheral vision, had not moved. Martin had set down his coffee cup and was watching Kessler's men with the attentive calm of someone who has been in enough situations to know when to be ready. "You're making a mistake," Kessler said. "Maybe." She moved her hands off the counter. "Door's right there." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, looked around the diner, at the flickering tube she'd replaced, at the worn booths, at the chalk menu her father had started and she'd kept, at the neon sign visible through the window. And his expression was unreadable, which was somehow more unsettling than contempt would have been. "Tell your husband," he said quietly, "that this conversation happened." He walked out. The two men followed. The door swung shut. Martin Kowalski cleared his throat. "You want us to stay till close?" Mara breathed. "Yeah," she said. "I'd appreciate that." "Oh." She called Lucien at 9:27. He picked up on the second ring. Of course he did. Kessler came to the diner, she said. A pause. Short. Are you okay? Yes, he didn't touch anything. He talked. She relayed it precisely the same way she relayed disasters. Factually, in order, without editorializing. When she finished, there was a silence on his end that had a different quality from his usual silences. This one had motion in it, things moving. He said to tell you the conversation happened, she said. I heard you. What does that mean? It means he's identified me as the variable. His voice was controlled, flat in the way of controlled. He's communicating that he intends to use that. The federal inquiry. Yes. Can he? Another pause. Longer. He can try to direct attention toward my arrangements. Whether that succeeds depends on how much his own exposure motivates certain people to accept his information. He paused. It's a play. It's not a stupid one. Mara stood in the back office. The dinner service had wound down. Danny was cleaning the kitchen. The Kowalski brothers were in their booth with refilled coffee, doing her the dignity of pretending they were just staying for the coffee. Lucien, she said. Yes. What do you need to do? To protect yourself. That's not... What do you need to do? Harder. Clearer. Tell me what the actual situation is. Not the managed version. The real one. A long pause. I have documentation, he said, that I've been building for 18 months. On Kessler. On Briggs and Ewan. On 3 other members of the council and 2 federal officials who've been facilitating certain arrangements that benefit Kessler's development arm. She heard him breathe. If I deliver that to the right place, to Walsh, the agent today, she's straight. I have reason to believe that it creates a situation where Kessler's capacity to direct attention toward me is significantly reduced, because his own exposure becomes total. So give it to her. If I give it to her, my own arrangements become visible in the process. My equilibrium, your arrangement with whoever is tolerating what you do, yes, it breaks. It becomes renegotiable at best. A pause. At worst, it breaks. Yes. Mara pressed her free hand flat against the office wall, the plaster old and soft. And if it breaks? Then the next period of my life looks significantly different from the last one. He said it simply. No drama. She closed her eyes, opened them. The diner, she said, is secured regardless, he said immediately. The marriage is on record. The property transfer is moot. Whatever happens to me doesn't change that. I'm not asking about the diner. Silence. I know, he said quietly. I'm asking what happens to you. The silence stretched. Outside the office door, she could hear Danny stacking chairs, the sound of the kitchen fan winding down, Martin Kowalski's low voice saying something to his brother, the ordinary sounds of the diner at the end of a night, the sounds she'd been hearing her whole life. The offer you made me, she said, the contract. You said once the threat was gone, I owe you nothing. You said that. I said that. Were you planning this when you said it? Giving Walsh the documentation, blowing up your own arrangement? Were you planning to do that regardless? A long pause, the longest since she'd called. Yes, he said. She absorbed that. So you were going to do it anyway, whether or not I said yes, whether or not we went to the county clerk, whether or not any of this. The corridor needed to be stopped, he said. For my own reasons. Kessler needed to be stopped. I was always going to do that. Then why the contract? Why the marriage? Why not just... Because the property needed a legal owner who wasn't me. His voice was quieter now, more careful. My name on a deed would have created complications. You needed to be married to keep the clause. Both things were true. I solved both. He paused. But that's not... He stopped. Say it, she said. That's not why I said yes. The fluorescent light in the back office hummed. The dog with a broken ear water stain was above her. She'd been looking at it so long it had become familiar, like everything in this place. Worn into her, part of the texture of what she was. You need to give Walsh the documentation, she said. Mara, tonight, she said, before Kessler moves first. She heard her own voice and it was steadier than she had any right to. You said she was straight. You said you had reason to believe that. Yes. Then you go to her tonight. You don't wait. She breathed. Do you have her contact? Yes. Then call her. A beat. And Lucien? Yes. Come to the diner. After. When it's done. She stopped herself, pressed forward. Come to the diner. The silence was different this time. Something in it that she didn't have the vocabulary for yet. Some quality of attention held for a very long time encountering the possibility of release. I'll come to the diner, he said. She hung up. She stood in the back office with the phone in her hand and the water stain above her and the sounds of closing time around her, and she understood that she had just told a man she'd married that morning under a legal clause in her dead father's will to go dismantle his own life and then come find her in a diner on Ferris Street. She understood something else, too. She'd meant it, both parts. At 10:43, Danny left. At 10:48, Martin Kowalski looked at her and said, You sure you're good? I'm sure, she said. Thank you, Martin. He put a 20 on the table, too much for 2 coffees, same as always, and walked out with his brother. The diner was empty. She turned off the main lights, left the counter light on, started the closing routine, wiping down tables, stacking chairs, the muscle memory of it, the comfort of procedure when everything else was in motion. She was on the 3rd table when she heard it. Not the front door, the back door, the alley entrance. 3 hard knocks, specific and urgent, and before she'd finished processing the sound, her body was already moving toward the counter, and her hand was already reaching under it for the phone. And then the back door opened, and it was Caleb. And he was not the easy smile, careful Caleb she'd been managing all week. He was pale and breathing wrong, and his jacket was gone, and he looked like a man who had been walking fast for a long time and had run out of directions. She straightened. They looked at each other across the length of the diner. I need help, he said. His voice was wrong, stripped of everything she'd ever heard in it. The calibration, the management, all of it gone, raw underneath. Mara, I know I have no right to be here. I know that, but I need... What happened? Kessler. He pressed his hand against the doorframe. He's not... Mara, the federal thing today, Walsh. She found something in the filing that ties back to me. Not just peripherally. I was the one who found out about the will clause. I was the one who told Kessler it was enforceable. I did the research on your father's property. I did all of it. He looked at her. His eyes were dark with something that was almost shame, except that shame in Caleb had always had a performance quality, and this didn't. This was just the fact of what he'd done, naked in the diner's low light. I didn't know he was going to use it to... I didn't know how far... He stopped. I need to talk to someone. Before Walsh comes for me, You need to give Walsh everything you know, Mara said. He stared at her. About Kessler. About the corridor. About what you researched. All of it. She kept her voice even. Caleb, look at me. She waited until he did. I am not going to help you hide. But if you go to Walsh tonight, if you walk in and give her everything, that's the only play you have left. He looked at her for a long moment. She remembered standing in this diner at 23 when he'd first walked in, before the engagement, before the 3 years and the bank account in November and all of it. Remembered thinking he was someone she could trust. She didn't feel anything clean about being right. The address, she said. Gerald has Walsh's contact through the federal office. I'll text you Gerald's number. She picked up her phone, did it while she was talking. You call Gerald, you tell him I sent you, you go tonight. She looked up. Do you understand me? He was still looking at her, something in his expression that was too complicated for one word. Yeah, he said. I understand. Go, she said. He went. The back door closed. Mara stood in the empty diner and pressed her hands flat on a table and breathed. The neon sign outside threw its familiar color through the window, the specific red-pink of it, the sign her father had chosen because he liked the way it looked in rain. It painted the far wall in low pulses, steady and small, the way it always did this time of night. She picked up a cloth. She kept cleaning. At 11:41, the front door opened. She didn't turn around immediately. She knew the sound of it. She'd been learning the specific qualities of that sound for 7.5 months without knowing she was learning them. The same way she'd been learning everything about him. Slowly, in the way of things that matter without announcing. She heard him cross the floor. Not fast, not slow. The same pace he always used, measured, deliberate, like a man who had decided long ago that the speed at which he moved was not going to be dictated by anything outside himself. She'd been learning that pace for 7.5 months without knowing she was cataloging it, the same way she'd been learning everything about him, in the accumulated detail of things that matter before you understand why. She kept wiping down the table. He stopped on the other side of it. She looked up. He looked different, not dramatically. His face was the same face, the contained stillness, the light eyes, but something had shifted in the quality of the containment, like a structure that has borne weight and is still standing but knows now, specifically, what weight feels like. There was a tiredness in him that she hadn't seen before. Not exhaustion, something more specific than that. The particular tiredness of a person who has done something that cannot be undone and has made their peace with it on the walk over. "It's done," he said. She set the cloth down. "Walsh?" "Walsh." He nodded once. 3 hours. I gave her everything. And your arrangement is currently under review. He said it with the flatness of someone describing weather, which is the diplomatic version of saying it's over. The people I had an understanding with are not interested in maintaining that understanding once federal documentation enters the picture. A pause. That's how it works. Mara looked at him across the table, at this man who had walked into her life through a back door and spent 7.5 months sitting in a corner booth drinking black coffee and reading Italian novels while knowing things she hadn't known, who had married her this morning in 11 minutes in a government building while a clock ran toward a deadline, who had just handed federal investigators the documentation that dismantled his own position in the world he'd inherited. "Sit down," she said. He pulled out a chair, sat. She went behind the counter, poured 2 coffees, not from the fresh pot. There wasn't one at this hour, from the one that had been sitting since 8 and was the kind of terrible that you drink when terrible coffee is the honest option. She brought them over, sat across from him. He wrapped both hands around the cup, didn't drink yet, looked at it. "Tell me what happens now," she said. "Practically. What does your life look like?" He considered the question without deflecting it, which she'd come to understand was one of the consistent things about him. He didn't use vagueness to manage distance. "The documentation implicates Kessler completely. Briggs and Ewan, 3 others. Walsh has enough to move on all of them within the week." He looked up. "The corridor project dies. The financing falls apart without the political cover. The properties Kessler already acquired go into legal limbo while the investigation proceeds. And 414 Ferris Street is yours," he said, unambiguously. "The marriage satisfies the clause. The clause is the only mechanism by which the estate could have transferred, and with Kessler's legal team about to be occupied with federal charges, any further challenge to the ownership is an orphaned effort. Nobody will fund it." He held her gaze. "The diner is yours, Mara. That part is finished." She nodded, breathed. "Your arrangements," she said, "the things you were doing, the leverage, the information. Does Walsh have any of that?" "Some of it." He was precise about this. "What she has is specifically what relates to Kessler and the council members. I was careful about what I included." He paused. "I'm not untouchable. I never claimed to be. But what she has is enough to move on Kessler and not enough to do much with me." A pause. "Whether that remains true over time depends on factors I can't fully control. Meaning, you might still have a problem. Meaning, I'm in a period of uncertainty." He said it plainly. Which is honest. She drank the terrible coffee, set the cup down. "You could have done all of that. Walsh, the documentation, the whole thing, without me, without the marriage. You said yourself the diner would have been part of the corridor fallout regardless." "Yes." "So the clause was the only reason you needed me to be married?" "Yes." He held her gaze. "Legally, yes. But—" He looked at his coffee, then back at her. "But I kept coming back to the diner for 7 months before I'd figured out how to approach the Kessler situation. Before the timing was right. Before I had everything I needed." He paused. "I kept coming back because I—" He stopped. Started again. "Sitting in that booth was the only place in this city where I felt like a man sitting in a diner. Not what my name meant, not what I'd inherited, not the weight of any of it. He looked at her steadily. You gave me that, without knowing you were giving it. The neon sign outside threw its pulse across the wall. The refrigeration unit hummed. In the kitchen, the fan had clicked off, and the silence from that direction was complete. You should have told me, she said. Not heated, just true. Yes. Not all of it. Not at the counter that first night, but before the county clerk. Before the ceremony. Yes, he said again. No qualification, no defense. She appreciated that. The absence of defense. She'd spent enough time around people who defended themselves reflexively to understand what it cost someone to simply agree to the thing they'd gotten wrong. My father, she said. He waited. The clause. He wrote it because he thought it would push me toward something. He always thought I isolated myself too much, worked too hard and let too few people in. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. He used to say, not often, just occasionally, that I'd learned to be self-sufficient so young that I'd confused it with being whole. She paused. He wasn't wrong. He was annoying about it, but he wasn't wrong. He sounds like someone who paid attention, Lucien said. He paid attention to everything except what was going to kill him, she said. He ignored the symptoms for 8 months before he went to a doctor. By then it was already too late for most options. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with that fact and breathed through it. He knew the diner was in trouble. He knew I'd been holding it together with wire and stubbornness. I think he thought... She stopped. I think he thought if he forced the issue, if he made the stakes high enough, I'd finally let someone in. And did he know about the Kessler interest? She looked at Lucien. Did he? A pause. Honest. I don't know. I know Diane was approached before he died. I don't know if he found out. He held her gaze. I've asked myself that question. I don't have an answer. She nodded slowly. If he did know, she said, and he still wrote that clause, that's either the most loving thing he ever did or the most reckless. With people who commit fully, Lucien said, it's usually both. She looked at him. How long have you known about my father? Since I started looking into the property. Then you knew he was sick before I did. I knew he had a condition. I didn't know the severity. A pause. I'm not going to tell you. That makes it better. No, she said. It doesn't. She pressed her palms flat on the table surface, the worn wood, the gouge from her father's key. But I'm also not going to pretend that you being in that booth every night for 7 months didn't matter, because it did. She met his eyes. It mattered even before I knew you were there on purpose, which is a strange thing to have to say out loud. Something shifted in his expression. The thing she'd seen on the sidewalk that afternoon, the unguarded quick movement that he hadn't managed to contain. It was back, and this time he didn't try to contain it. The contract, he said, what I said when I offered it, that once the threat was gone, you'd owe me nothing, that you could walk away. I remember. I meant it. I want to be clear that I meant it. He held her gaze. The exit is real. The marriage is legal, and it can be legally ended, and you would leave it with full ownership of the property, and no entanglement in anything that comes next for me. That's a clean option, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't the reasonable one. Mara looked at him for a long moment. You're making your case for me to leave, she said. I'm making sure you know it's available. Those aren't the same thing. He was quiet. Lucien. She said his name the way she'd said it that first time, on the sidewalk outside the county clerk, with the specific weight of a word that had started to mean more than the sounds it was made of. If I stay, not legally, not on paper, but actually stay, what does that look like? Given the uncertainty you mentioned, given what the next period of your life is. He considered this the way he considered everything she asked him directly, fully, without performance. Uncertain, he said. Complicated by things I can't fully predict. Not violent. I want to be honest about that. The world I operate in deals in information and leverage, not in the kind of violence that would touch you. But not clean. Not simple. He paused. I don't have a version of what I am that is simple. I don't need simple, she said. You need honest. Yes. Then I'll be honest with you. He held her gaze with the steadiness she'd come to understand was not coldness, had never been coldness, was something else entirely. The particular quality of a person who has decided that if they're going to be present, they're going to be fully present. No hedging, no distance. I came into your diner because of a property corridor. I stayed because of you. I said yes to your note because I wanted to, and because it solved a logistical problem, and both of those things were true at the same time, and I should have told you which one I'd have said yes for regardless. He paused. For the record, I'd have said yes regardless. The neon sign pulsed. Mara looked at the man across the table. This stranger she'd married. This man who'd sat in her corner booth for 7.5 months and never asked her anything she didn't want to answer, who'd moved pieces she couldn't see to clear a path she hadn't known was blocked, who'd dismantled his own position in the world tonight and walked through her door afterward with 2 cups worth of bad coffee, worth of honesty left in him. My father, she said, used to say that the people worth keeping are the ones who show up after the problem is solved. Lucian looked at her. You showed up, she said. That's either meaningful or it's just geography. It's not geography, he said quietly. She stood, picked up both cups, brought them to the counter, rinsed them in the sink, the water cold because the boiler had cooled, and she stood with her back to him for a moment, just letting herself be a person at a sink at the end of a very long day. Then she turned around. I'm going to open the diner in the morning, she said. 6:30. Eggs and coffee. Mrs. Papadakis will want her tea. The Kowalski brothers will want whatever they always want. She looked at him across the length of the diner, this place that smelled like her father and 30 years of the same lives. You can come at 9 if you want. Same booth. I'll have the coffee ready. He looked at her. Same order? He said. Same order. He nodded once. That contained deliberate nod. Then I'll be here at 9. She turned the counter light off, left the neon sign on, the way her father always had. He'd believed in being visible from the street, had said a dark sign was a closed door, and he wanted the diner to look open even when it wasn't, wanted it to look like somewhere people could come. She'd argued with him about the electric bill. She'd kept the habit anyway. She walked to the front door, unlocked it, held it. He stood, looked at her one more time across the dim room. Then he walked out into the street. She locked the door behind him. She stood in the empty diner for a moment, both hands on the door handle, and looked at the room. The booths, the counter, the kitchen window, the chalk menu board her father had started, the gouge in the counter wood, the new fluorescent tube burning too bright above it all. She thought, Ray Ellison, you impossible man. She turned off the last light. She went to the back office and lay down on the cot and looked at the water stain on the ceiling, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she fell asleep before she finished a thought. The morning was different, not in any way she could have pointed to specifically. The light was the same gray Friday into Saturday light. The coffee maker beeped at the same time. Danny came in at 6:28 with his jacket and his apron and looked at her face and said nothing, which was still the correct response. But something had settled. That was the only word she had for it. The way sediment settles after water has been disturbed. Not disappeared, not resolved into something clean and simple, but settled. Down to a level where she could see through it. The morning regulars came. She made eggs and poured coffee and smiled at Mrs. Papadakis and updated the chalkboard and did all of it with her hands and let her mind be quiet for the first time in weeks. Just the work. Just the familiar weight of it. At 8:45, Gerald Holt called. She stepped into the back for 3 minutes and took it. Caleb went to Walsh last night, Gerald said. He sounded surprised, in the way of people who have stopped expecting pleasant surprises. Late, after midnight, he gave a full statement, names, dates, his role in researching the property clause. A pause. He implicated himself significantly. Will it help him? Cooperating witnesses generally... Gerald paused. Yes, it will likely help him. He'll face consequences, but cooperation matters. Another pause. The federal inquiry is moving fast, Mara. Walsh moved on Kessler this morning. Briggs has already retained a separate counsel from Ewan, which means one of them is looking to cooperate first. He paused. The corridor project is finished. The properties Kessler acquired are frozen assets in an active federal investigation. The zoning changes are being reviewed and will almost certainly be reversed. And the diner is yours, Gerald said. I've reviewed everything. With Diane's attorney's motion withdrawn and the marriage on record, there's no viable challenge. Even if someone wanted to pursue it, there's no legal ground and no financial interest willing to fund a fight. A pause. Your father's clause is satisfied. The property is yours, Mara, as of yesterday morning. She stood in the back office with the phone pressed against her ear. The dog with a broken ear water stain was above her. Thank you, Gerald, she said, for everything. Call me if anything changes, he said, though I don't think it will. A pause, and then, with the specific warmth of a tired man who has delivered enough bad news to appreciate the good. He'd be pleased, you know, your father. He really would. She managed something that was almost steady. Yeah, she said. I know. She hung up. She stood there for a moment. Then she went back to the floor. Diane came in at 10. Mara saw her through the window before she came in. Saw her standing on the sidewalk outside, looking at the diner the way she'd looked at it in the conference room, with the expression of someone doing an accounting. Then she straightened her shoulders, which was the most honest thing Mara had ever seen her do, and came through the door. The morning rush had cleared. 3 tables still occupied. Danny was in the back. Mara was behind the counter. Diane sat at the counter. They looked at each other. I didn't know about the investigation, Diane said. I want you to know that. Kessler's attorney contacted me about the property. I thought it was straightforward development interest. I didn't know about the council members. I didn't know it was... She paused. I didn't know the scope of it. Mara looked at her, looked at the careful silver hair, the cream blouse, the pressed exactness of a woman who had maintained a surface through a marriage that hadn't worked, and a grief she hadn't let herself have in public. She didn't know what was underneath Diane's surface. She'd never known. She'd never tried to know. And to be honest, Diane had never offered. You signed a letter of intent 2 days after the funeral, Mara said. Diane's jaw tightened. I know. While I was still... She stopped. Let it go. Picked it back up. While I was still sleeping in the back office because I couldn't go home. I know, Diane said again. And something in her voice was different from every other version of this conversation Mara had imagined. Not defensive, not managed, just the plain weight of it. Did you know about the will clause before he died? A pause. He told me about it. Not as a... He didn't tell me as a mechanism. He said it in passing. He thought... She stopped. He thought if he left you something that required you to reach out, you would. He thought you'd been alone long enough. She met Mara's eyes. He talked about you constantly. I want you to know that. Whatever else, he talked about you constantly. Mara pressed her jaw together, breathed through her nose. I'm not going to pursue any further legal action on the property, Diane said. The letter of intent is void with Kessler's assets frozen, and I wouldn't. She paused. He built this place. It should be yours. It always should have been yours. Mara looked at her for a long moment. She thought about her father, who had committed fully to every beautiful, impossible thing he'd believed in, who had married a woman he didn't quite understand and tried anyway, who had left his daughter a property clause like a message in a bottle, impractical, slightly absurd, completely characteristic. Do you want coffee? Mara said. Diane blinked. What? Coffee. It's not the best this time of morning. The fresh pot was an hour ago, but it's honest. She held Diane's gaze. Do you want some? A long pause. Something shifted in Diane's face. The surface of it, the careful maintenance of it, gave slightly around the edges. Not collapse, just give. Yes, Diane said. Thank you. Mara poured 2 cups, set one in front of Diane, kept one for herself. They sat on opposite sides of the counter in the late morning light and drank terrible coffee together. And it was not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but it was the first thing that might become something, eventually, and that was enough for a Saturday morning. He came in at 9:04, not 9 on the dot. She'd half expected 9 on the dot, had been watching the door from 9 onward with an attention she didn't attempt to justify. But 9:04 because he was not performing promptness. He was simply arriving when he arrived, and that was exactly right. He hung his jacket on the hook by the corner booth, set down his bag, sat. She poured the coffee before he asked, brought it over. He looked up when she set it down. The same look he always gave her, that quality of attention that had felt strange when she hadn't known what to make of him, and now felt like something she'd been reading for years. "Cherry pie?" she said. "Please." She cut a slice, brought it over, and then, instead of going back behind the counter, she stayed, stood beside the table. He looked at her, questioning. "Move over," she said. He moved over. She slid into the booth across from him and put her elbows on the table and looked at him in the morning light. This man who had complicated her life in ways she hadn't asked for and hadn't known she needed, who had told her the truth in pieces and paid a significant price for the whole of it, who was sitting in her corner booth with a cup of bad coffee and a slice of pie, and the particular expression of someone who had decided that wherever he was exactly where he intended to be. "Walsh called me this morning," he said. "About?" "She wants me to consider a formal cooperation agreement in exchange for—" He paused. "In exchange for access to certain information I have that goes beyond the Kessler documentation." He held her gaze. "It would involve a significant restructuring of my situation. More visibility than I'm accustomed to. More accountability. But it's a path to something that isn't contingent." He said the word carefully. "What I've been doing has been contingent on the tolerance of people who had their own reasons for tolerating it. This would be different, less free, more stable." He paused. "Walsh thinks I'm a useful variable in the long term." "She's probably not wrong." Mara looked at him. "What do you think?" "I think I spent 18 months building documentation on Kessler because I was angry about what was happening to neighborhoods I'd spent years working in," he said. "And somewhere in there I stopped being solely angry about the corridor and started being angry on behalf of a diner on Ferris Street and the woman who ran it." He looked at her directly. "I think I've been making decisions based on who I wanted to be rather than who I was. And I think those decisions led me here." A pause. "I think here is better than where I was." Mara looked at him for a long time. Outside the diner, Ferris Street was doing what it did on Saturday mornings. The dry cleaners open next door, the sound of the garage on 5th already running, a delivery truck making its slow turn at the corner. The city in its ordinary motion, doing what cities do, unremarkable and complete. "My father built this place," she said, "because he believed in it. Not because he knew it would work. Not because the numbers made sense. They didn't. Not really. Not for years. Because he believed in the thing itself." She looked at her hands on the table. "I used to think that was impractical. That belief wasn't a business plan." She looked up. "I still think it's impractical, but I think he was right anyway." Lucien looked at her. "The cooperation agreement," she said. "If you sign it, what does that look like day to day?" "More structured than I'm used to," he said. "Less autonomy, but legitimate. Actually legitimate, which is something I haven't been in—" He stopped. "A long time." "Would you still be in the city?" "Yes." "Would you still be available for black coffee and cherry pie at 9 in the morning?" Something in his expression moved, the unguarded thing, the one she'd been learning to read. "Yes," he said. "I would still be available for that." She nodded, looked at the table, looked back at him. "Then talk to Walsh," she said. "Take the agreement if it's the right thing. Do the structured, less autonomous, actually legitimate version of whatever comes next." She held his gaze. "And come to the diner." "Every night?" "Every night." He looked at her across the table, at the counter behind her, at the kitchen window, at the chalk menu board, at the new fluorescent tube above the counter that was still burning off its newness and would settle into something less aggressive in another week. He looked at all of it the way a person looks at something they've been looking at for a long time and have only just allowed themselves to see completely. "Okay," he said. She picked up his coffee cup and stood. "I'll get you a fresh cup," she said. "That one's been sitting." She went behind the counter, poured fresh coffee, brought it back and set it in front of him. He wrapped both hands around it the way he always did, and she stood beside the table for a moment because there was something she'd been carrying and she wanted to set it down before she went back to work. "What my father left me," she said. "The clause. The whole impossible thing." She looked at Lucien. I spent 3 weeks thinking it was the worst decision he ever made. Reckless, impractical, embarrassing, if I'm honest. I had to ask a stranger to marry me at midnight in an empty diner. She paused. But he knew me. He knew I'd isolate and work and hold everything together alone until I fell apart or lost it all. He knew I wouldn't let anyone in unless I had no other option. She looked at her hands. He gave me no other option. And? She looked at Lucian. And here you are, in the booth. She managed something that was not quite a smile and was something better than one. So maybe he knew what he was doing. Lucian looked at her for a moment. He raised you, he said quietly. He knew exactly what he was doing. She went back behind the counter. She picked up a cloth and started wiping down the surface. The good, mindless motion of it, the worn wood under her hands, the work that had been the ground under her feet since she was 12 years old. Danny came out of the kitchen and said something about the lunch prep, and she answered, and it was just the normal conversation of a normal morning in a diner on Ferris Street. In the corner booth, Lucian opened his book. The neon sign outside was dark in the daylight, but she knew it was there. She knew it the way she knew the gouge in the counter and the water stain on the back office ceiling and the specific sound of the door when it opened in the morning versus when it opened at night. She knew this place the way she knew herself. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of those things felt like isolation. The coffee maker beeped. She poured. The diner stayed open.